Hello everyone, I'm Carolyn Meyer. Welcome to In Depth with TommieMedia. Today we turn to mind games, so to speak. Success on the field or the court is not just about physical skills. The mind is part of winning too. The scientific and sports communities agree that mental toughness is one of the most important attributes, and psychologists are working to reinforce the mind-body connection. I'm joined today by John Tower, psychology professor and men's basketball coach, to discuss the importance of psychological tools in athletics. Thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here, Carolyn.
So, Dr. Tower, experts have compared teachers to coaches. How do you apply your academic teaching and research to your coaching?
Well, I think that's a really appropriate comparison. That I always say that coaches could learn a lot from teachers, and teachers could learn a lot from coaches, right? That I think teachers are great at sort of the cognitive instruction and trying to get people mentally engaged in whatever discipline it is they're teaching. But sometimes as teachers, we don't always build teams within a class, right? A culture where everybody feels like we're connected. And some of that's the nature of the discipline, that if I asked you if you wanted an A in class, but you didn't connect much with your fellow students, or you wanted a B- in class, but you walked out of there feeling like you were part of a team, you might choose the A. As coaches, what we're trying to do is build great teams, but I think where we can really learn from our counterparts in academia is how can we engage student athletes mentally where they really are being incredibly thoughtful, aware, reflective, all those mental tools that you allude to, while still being physically engaged. And that is I think one of the beautiful parts of sports is that it's not just sitting there thinking and reading a book and taking a test, and it's not just running really fast, it's trying to do both the physical and the mental at the same time, under pressure, in competition against someone else, knowing what the stakes are. And that's why it's really tough to excel, and competitive greatness is a special quality.
So it can go both ways.
No question. I think, part of what I love about being in an academic institution like St.Thomas is you can be a lifelong learner. That even though I've taught here and coached here 18 years, I just walked out of a motivation and emotion class, and I think the students probably taught me as much or more than I taught them. And so as coaches, we always talk about it can get kind of old if you're just teaching how to defend a screen and roll. Like that can get old after 18 years, but teaching people, working with people, that never gets old because everyone's so unique. And so I think both teachers and coaches, there are a lot of similarities, and probably we could learn a lot more from one another.
Absolutely. And sports can be a mind game. What are some strategies that help athletes prepare to enter competition with a proper mindset?
Well, when you talk about that, one of the distinctions we make is there's workers and there's competitors. And it sounds the same, but the workers are the players that they'll do anything you ask. They'll run through a wall. But quite frankly, when the bright lights come on, sometimes they don't excel. And then you've got other players who aren't always the best practice players, but when it's a sellout crowd in a championship game, the level of their play rises. And so, in an ideal world, you'd love to have every player be both a worker and a competitor. But when you're looking at what allows people to rise to that moment, I think it is more mental than physical, right? We talk about approach motivation versus avoidance motivation, and avoidance motivation is don't screw up, right? If you're at the free throw line and you're thinking, don't miss this free throw, there's a good chance you're going to miss. Other people get to the free throw line and they're thinking this is 2 easy points. And so that psychological mindset of being excited, being approach-oriented, being curious, trusting your teammates, there are all sorts of qualities that, if you took a course in positive psychology, you'd learn all these attributes that help lead to kind of the good life, so to speak. And I think that's very true in athletics, that those same qualities kind of help make up someone who's going to flourish under pressure. And that's not an easy thing, I can tell you that you work individually with athletes, and there are so many moving parts and variables that at the end of the day, you look at the best players in the world, the Michael Jordans, the LeBron Jameses, they'll both readily admit they've failed probably as much as they've succeeded. And so that's part of the other I think key is not being afraid of failure.
Mm-hmm.
Going out there and saying, look, we play sports for a lot of reasons, and win or lose, we're going to give it. It sounds cliche, but we're going to give it everything we can. And if you're not afraid to fail, those are the teams that we always talk about daring to be great as one of our goals as a program, and that means out of 425 schools in the country, dare to be number one, and that's a daunting goal, but it's also, I think, an energizing one. Absolutely.
And going back to workers and competitors, how does having a little bit of both affect the team dynamic?
That's an interesting question, because you don't necessarily want to classify, right? I wouldn't tell our team, hey, you 6 are the workers, you're the 8 competitors,
right.
Because in an ideal world, we're all going to get to a place where we're good at both of them. But I think there's no question that the chemistry within a team, when you have players who excel in practice and all their teammates know you can do it in the game, they know they can do it, they trust, they want them to. But it doesn't always happen, at least early sometimes in people's career. I think that, you try to reinforce, you try and encourage, you try and show film where you say, hey, look, here's what you're doing in practice. There's no reason, the old Hoosiers movie, I don't know if you see, I'm dating
Absolutely.
myself, but you remember when he measures the hoop and shows that, hey, it's still only 10 feet high. I mean, there is an element of the court's 94 feet long by 50 feet wide, and that doesn't change. And so much of success in athletics is getting the workers to realize, like, hey, just shut your brain off. We joke about that a lot with our team. We have a lot of engineering majors, computer science majors, actuarial science, brilliant guys, and sometimes brilliant to a fault, where we joke with them. They just stop thinking, because at the end of the day, we talk, when you get into a competition, there's conscious and unconscious competence. And conscious competence means you know what you're good at and you're effortfully and thoughtfully trying to accomplish it. But being in a zone, unconscious competence is where you flip that switch and you go and you trust all the practice. And I, so your question, which I think is a great one, ultimately we want those workers and competitors to almost be so well practiced that they aren't thinking about anything.
And according to my research, negative psychological factors can cause breaks in focus and preparation, poor performance, and even injury. How can athletes overcome mental and emotional breakdowns?
I think that question is important, because so often the media, I think, likes to portray, I'll go back to Michael Jordan, as the most clutch player of all time. And again, he didn't make every shot. The reality is, when you're in those really critical moments, championship games, more often, it's not always one player is performing way better than normal, right? Oftentimes it's which player or team is going to screw up the least. So when you look at mental breakdowns, those lead to turnovers. Those lead to missed assignments and coverages that give up layups. And so it's not necessarily, pressure doesn't help most people perform out of this world. If it did, we'd try to simulate that all the time. The reality is pressure oftentimes debilitates. And I think the best programs and coaches and athletes try to simulate those psychological mindsets. So how do you simulate pressure in practice? Whether it's team that loses runs, you miss a free throw, you run. How do you create a situation where it's not going to be the same as a championship game, but you can mimic it? I always say, look, if you want to get really good at free throw shooting, make 1 free throw a day. And everybody looks at you like, well, that's not very tough. Well, but if you miss the free throw, go run a mile out on the track. And now all of a sudden you're going to be standing at the free throw line and you miss it and you go run your mile, and now you got to come back and run another or shoot another free throw. After 2 or 3 of those, you're going to have that same process, because ultimately as an athlete, you've got biologically what's going on, and we so often forget that matters, psychologically what's going on, environmentally around us what's going on, and all of those factors can interfere with peak performance. And at the end of the day, all we want athletes to do is just be themselves and trust muscle memory. And so as much as I love sports psychology, one of my take-homes to our guys oftentimes is one of the biggest messages from sports psychology is stop thinking so much, right? Think before practice, think before the game, but once that starts, turn your brain off, and you just got to trust that we prepared properly and let the chips fall where they may.
And as a coach, do you find it as your role to kind of help your players through these challenges?
Well, I think that's a huge part of coaching, right? That if you were to take the 425 teams in the country and line them up and say, let's measure their heights, I don't think St. Thomas, we don't have an abundance of 6'9" players. If you were to measure their sprint times or their verticals, I don't think you'd see that big of a difference. And so when you look at what does make programs special and what helps them be successful, I think at a collective level, it's going to be teamwork and trust in one another and those bonds that on the court, and especially in big games, I know I can trust you and vice versa. On an individual level, though, it's going to be each player knowing that he or she has put in the work and their performance isn't going to deviate. We always talk about don't be volatile like a stock market. Just be consistently excellent and try and get a little better every day. And if you can do that, now we can go out on the court and have a pretty good idea of how we're going to play. Whereas the teams that are up and down, and you look at March Madness starting here this week, to win 6 games in a national tournament, you're not going to win 6 games like this. You might upset somebody, and the next game you're going to get upset. So to win 6 games, it's going to have to be this kind of really steady, sustainably excellent performance. And I think as coaches, that's a huge part of our job now. That's easier said than done, right? Because if everybody could do it, then you'd see all teams performing at that level. I think a lot of what we try to do is get our guys to buy into this notion of strive for excellence and don't focus as much on the outcome as you do the process.
And you talked about up and down performance. Do things like hot streaks, cold streaks, and momentum actually exist? And how large of a role do they play in performance?
That's one of my favorite questions in sports psychology, to be honest. There's a famous study by Tom Gilovich and his colleagues on the hot hand, and they sort of debunked the hot hand. And this was several decades ago, but they studied some sports teams, the Philadelphia 76ers being one of them, and they were able to show that your odds of making your next shot if you made your previous 3 wasn't drastically different than if you had missed your previous 3. That the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So if I want to know the likelihood you're going to make your next shot, I want to know your overall percentage. That's more predictive than your last few shots. So generally speaking, I think as coaches, I think announcers, fans, we all overestimate the hot hand because it's like flipping a coin. Does a coin get hot? No, it's heads or tails. Most shooters are around 50%. Now, there is more recent evidence that there can be some hint of a hot hand, but it's certainly, let me put it to this way, if a guy's made 4 shots in a row, I'm not willing to have him take a really tough shot on the next possession because I think he has a hot hand. I'd rather we work it around and, again, play team ball, and whoever gets a really open shot, that's what we're going to strive for. So we could sit here and talk for literally hours about the research on the hot hand, but generally speaking, I'd say there is some hint that it exists, but largely it's overstated.
Okay, fair enough. And sports tend to be a natural incubator for superstitions. How do they enhance or hinder an athlete's performance?
When you think about what hinders the performance, I think there are a lot of qualities. So let me go back. Can you ask that? I want to make sure I understand.
Absolutely. So sports tend to be a natural incubator for superstitions. How do they enhance or hinder an athletic performance?
I think the way it can hinder is that it leads athletes to believe that things out of their control are actually in control, right? So if I think this is my lucky pair of shoes or this is my lucky pregame meal, what happens if we don't eat that before a big game? Now, the flip side is there is a lot to be said for being comfortable. And so you can see in almost all my answers, I'm not trying to hedge my bets, but I think as coaches, we do like routine because we know the more that a game day seems like any other day, the lower the physiological arousal, the more calm and collected our players will be, and they're naturally going to see their physiological arousal go up when they go out in front of a crowd and it's a big game. So we try to keep things as normal as possible. That said, one of the core values in our program is adaptability. And so I also want our players to be ready that in a national tournament game, you're going to suddenly play on Friday and Saturday when really all year we haven't played back-to-back games. So if we're just used to playing Monday, Wednesday, Saturday, and all of a sudden we play Friday, Saturday, and our players haven't been trained to adapt to anything, then that's going to be difficult. So I think superstitions are great as long as you can maintain them, but the risk is once they get broken, does someone think, well, I can't make a free throw anymore because I don't have my lucky pair of shoes on? I sure hope that's not the case.
Right, so for an athlete, adaptability is key.
Being adaptable and a lot of it, I keep coming back to this word trust, and it relates to confidence. trusting that all the work we've done to this point, that's all I have to do, and now I can just go be myself, right? And that's true in any job in the world, that when we're able to operate sort of on automatic pilot because we've done something so many times, the old adage, don't do it until you get it right, do it until you can't get it wrong. And that's when you know you're really, truly excellent at something, is when you've practiced enough. So as much as I love talking about the mind, you can't will yourself into being a great shooter. You have to practice, and then you have to sort of shut your mind off rather than overthinking it, and it's a little bit counterintuitive.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today, Dr. Tower.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
If you have a comment or an idea for a future in-depth segment, tweet us at TommieMedia. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for all the latest TommieMedia videos. Thanks for joining us. With Dr. John Tower, I'm Carolyn Meyer. We'll see you next time when we go in-depth with TommieMedia.